This is the Lean Construction Blogs Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories, case studies, and lessons learned of applying lean construction from around the world. Join Dick Beyer as he interviews industry leaders, lean construction practitioners, and subject matter experts to help you improve the build environment in general and your design and construction projects in particular, advance your lean journey, and bring your continuous improvement efforts to the next level. Let's get started.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Dick Beyer with the Lean Construction Blog Podcast. I'm Dick Beyer, and you're not. I'm so happy today to have finally wrangled up two people that I'm really interested in talking to about very important things that we have going on in the world of project delivery. And it's not just contract model delivery. It's really kind of the philosophy of how we best actually deliver projects rather than just manage contracts or whatever it is that we try to do. So my good friend Lisa Washington at the DBIA suggested that I get a hold of Geoff Neumayr and Robynne Thaxton, and I was able to do that. I actually met Geoff at the LCI Congress last year, and I'm sure I met Robynne somewhere along the line over the years, but I'm so happy to have you here. So I want to welcome to the podcast Robynne Thaxton and Geoff Neumayr. Hey, gang.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining in. This is, we used to talk about IPD as the flavor of the month or lean is the flavor of the month. This is clearly, with every public owner in Canada that we work with, they're all going, well, what about progressive design build? Why aren't we doing that? What does it take and all the rest of that? So I'm so happy to have you here. So let's get a little background. Let's start with Robynne. What's your background? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? What kind of got you interested in doing this stuff? And then we'll jump back to Geoff.
Oh, okay. I'm a Texan. Grew up in Texas. Went to undergrad at the University of Texas, and like you, Dick, went to University of Colorado Law School. Woo-hoo. Started everything off as a lawyer, and I was an employment lawyer first, and then I moved to Seattle. I became a construction lawyer, and one of the things that drove me crazy was the fact that they were asking a baby lawyer, like our owner clients were asking me what to do on these issues, and I'm like, why don't you just talk to the contractor that I couldn't understand that construction by combat kind of situation. It drove me crazy for many years. And so when I started I did a design build project for a private owner. It was one of our local billionaires putting a golf course on his private island. I know, first world problems right there. Yeah. But I was looking at the contract, and that whole process just fascinated me. And then I went in-house with a telecommunications firm, and we were doing basically a progressive design build out. We didn't call it that then. It was in the mid 90s. Build out of their telecommunications, their fiber optic, and all of the support facilities. It was around 200 million when that was actually a lot of money. Isn't that cute? And I just became more and more interested in it, got involved with DBIA, and have been pushing for that kind of, you don't have to develop everything immediately situation, to kind of go back to what was a very, very collaborative contract. And so when the state of Washington, which is where I am in, I live in the Seattle area, when we started to think about from a legislation standpoint, what would be kind of our best practices, we started to look at progressive design build. And so I helped to pass the legislation that allowed public agencies to be able to do it. That was in 2013, and that's been most of my practice. And now I work mostly as a consultant. I'm both an attorney and a consultant, but mostly what I do is I help people put together their procurements for these projects.
Awesome. Well, that trajectory almost exactly mirrors mine until we veer off on different roads, because I always tell people I started off my professional life as a lawyer in that same pronunciation. But I was a civil litigator. So my frustration was that every major lawsuit I had, and I probably had, 30 jury trials for hundreds of $1 million construction cases, and somebody always lost their company in that process. It was terrible. So
Yeah,
I'm glad that we're simpatico about we could do this better. And Jeff, you must
exactly.
have that same kind of simpatico that drove you here. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I actually grew up here in California in the Bay Area in a place called Los Gatos, and went to went to high school down here in San Jose, California, in a school called Bellarmine, and always wanted to be an architect. I got this crazy idea actually, going to Bellarmine was actually itself very much of a college prep where you didn't take things like drafting and architecture classes and model building, but a lot of English, Latin, those types of things, and kind of an oddball in a place that really wanted to become into a real technical business. Well, I went ahead and applied and went to school in the Central Coast of California, Cal Poly, and was accepted into the architecture program at the College of Architecture and Environmental Design. And fundamentally, that's where things really began to change for me and opened up a whole world because, and a little bit of bragging about the alma mater. That it is one of the unique universities where within the same College of Architecture and Environmental Design, they house a department in construction management, architectural engineering, structural engineering, architecture, landscape, and city regional planning. And it was headed up by our dean, George Haslund at the time, who started that school way back in the 50s, that college, and with a vision of integration of the disciplines that were all involved in the process and always had this vision. And so I was blessed to actually practice. It went through 3 years of architecture school. And during that process, actually got interested in structural engineering of all things. And
Wow.
so, okay, after you've done the hard work of the third year, decided to change my major and shifted gears. Um, and actually finished up and loved to have gone back and finished architecture, but I was in the poorhouse by that time to get out of school. But during that journey, got to meet Nick Watry, who was my first boss, both the intern and really began to introduce me to this idea that you to think like a designer, you got to think like a builder. And to be a builder, you have to think like a designer. And I'm here, 20 something young, right? And going, this is great. Awesome. We're going to all be working as a team. Well, June 17th, 1984, start work. And it wasn't more than 3 months in the whole thing. You start working on a project and these things called RFIs started coming along.
Oh,
Right. Remember? And like,
oh yeah.
nobody's going to proceed until, and you respond to the RFI and you send it back in and it turns in, but you didn't answer my question. And here we go, and I remember in that process at that going, this has got to be crazy because this is nothing like the promise that was in school.
Right.
Lo and behold, I kind of learned to adapt to that, but realized that as Rob and I always talked about, that design and construction really was done by combat. And during that time, working for at that time Watry Engineering and ultimately the Watry Design Group, we did a lot of design build projects. At that time, was probably better known as what we call today best value. This is pre-DBIA, and did a lot of work at various places like Genentech and Stanford and other places that were high-end clients who had this little bit of collaboration where we didn't feel, particularly as an engineer and supporting the architecture staff, because we were both, we weren't like tied down and worried about somebody just slapping us over the head or getting into trouble and legal trouble and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden we became better at what we did and things always came out okay. Well, at that point, about 12 years later, I got involved in project management, joined a small company at the time, and ended up at the San Francisco International Airport as part of their master plan program. And lo and behold, back to managing low bid contracts,
Uh-oh.
huge contracts at the time.
Right.
Very much of a tough struggle for 5 years and getting through all these programs, and really got exposed to what design and construction done wrong was on a level I've never even thought possible. So it went from bad to really bad. And so I learned a lot of lessons between those two stages of seeing what it could look like at a very young age to what's really going on in check. At that point in time, as I carried through and finished the master plan, I got the opportunity to come back to San Francisco International Airport about 6 years later and participate in a project where we were struggling. And what happened is that there was some talk within the airport and the director, what could be possible. And we decided at the airport and as a consultant at the time, and I had a lot of input on that time because I'd been around the airport quite a bit, is what are the possibilities? And this idea of design build came up. And I said, oh yeah, design build's great. But all I knew at the time was the best value where you ultimately got to a fixed fee and talked about the idea of, yeah, you know what would be even better is one time way back at Stanford, they actually selected us as a team. And this is back in 1987 when this happened. And then they told us that we're just going to select you based off of the design. We're worried about the contractor pricing because they're going to gouge us. And we back and said, oh, no, they're not going to gouge you. What we can do is they'll commit to so much self-perform work. And even the mentioning of getting multiple bids on certain trades and whatnot and all this kind of stuff. And I remember back in how well that worked on Stanford's parking structure at that time, Stanford One. And it went really well and watched the team from afar as a project engineer. It was amazing. So I said, what if we try this on a secure connector project? At that time, I didn't know much about the term progressive design build. In fact, never heard of it. It was more of a process where we said, let's select the right team, let's work together, and then we'll work towards a GMP. We actually called it a progressive GMP because we incrementally pieced it up as we went, as we got pieces of the design. Because one of the things that went through my head was remembering how jobs remember how you used to have fast track all the time? That was the word,
Right.
fast track.
Yeah.
But fast track always ended up in court.
Yeah.
Everybody hated it, so it always took
I did a lot of
longer.
those. Yeah.
It took longer because people were missing coordination and everything and it was still happening because of the low bid mindset that was going on through the whole process. And it was more common in the private sector, but there was a lot of litigation in the private sector as well as the public sector at that point in time in the 80s. So we decided to go ahead and select a team. We did. And the project was actually scheduled for 14 months to complete. It wasn't a big job at that time. This is 2006, probably a $16 million job. Payments, $1 million under budget and 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Okay.
Maybe there's something there.
There's something there. And Dick, this is without lean tools or anything. This is actually Robynne project, like barely a contract in place. Legal didn't even know what to do with it because we hadn't even changed the administrative code. I know we'll talk later about how we got permission to do that in a pilot. This was a pilot program. Ultimately got permission to do it and moved on to Terminal 2 and started that in 2008, which was a renovation, which was probably at that time, probably the biggest progressive design build, what we call today, ever done. $440 million project at that time is probably $1 billion project today. We built a brand new, tore down a terminal, renovated portions of it in 32 months. 440 million. Think about that in 32 months. And it was a huge success. And the project, when it opened up, became actually at that time recognized as the best new terminal in the world at that point in time. Really set the stage for aviation and what was going to happen. And so that process, I was brought on following that project because I was a consultant on that project to be on the staff to really develop the progressive design build program at the airport, which led me into where we are. And we'll talk about that later, about that journey, where we began to not only revise our contract strategies more specifically about how to transform away from design bid build, but also how to develop new workflow processes around it. Because just because you have the contract in place, you also have to adjust what your behavior as an owner is and what that's going to mean, and start to introduce the concepts of lean construction into what we do every day and build those processes. It took years to get there, but through the time we got there, and then now here I am.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure if it's up to me, we're not going to keep you retired very long. So there's a ton of opportunities out there. It's funny that the three of us kind of came at this in similar ways, that we saw that the system was broken, it's not working, it doesn't provide value to the owners, so why do we do it? And the thing that always bothers me is that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have had that same epiphany and just walked away from it and said, oh, well,
Exactly.
not much we can do about it. What are you going to do? So this is fantastic. This is fantastic background, because I think it leads us into your role, your joint roles in developing both kind of on the contract side. It was funny, Jeff, that you apologized for contracts, because I think we all agree that contracts, I have a 14-year-old contract sitting next to my fireplace that's never built a thing. I keep waiting for it to, actually build something, and it just never does. But we all go back to the lawyers, and the lawyers go back to their traditional, books and their forms and everything. And in Canada, it's very, very specific about CCDC 30 and CCDC 14 and all of these kind of recommended contracts. And yet those recommended contracts are hugely amended on a regular basis for every project. And you go, well, if it's standard, why are you amending it? So how did you get into the kind of the design of the legal end of it, Robynne, in terms of what are we going to do in terms of a contract, and what kind of behaviors are we going to try to expect from a contractual model?
So I've been involved with the DBIA contracts for a very long time. Mike Loulakis brought me in on drafting those contracts back in, oh gosh, I want to say 2007 when we did the first revision of those contracts. It ended up, I think, that revision came out in 2010, but it took a long time. So I've spent a long time thinking about what is a best practice. So when I first started, I can tell you what my journey for that has been. I started off as an owner's lawyer, and then for about 15 years, I represented very, very large general contractors. And in looking at, the owners' contracts up, they assume the worst, the absolute worst from the contractors, and the contractors assume the absolute worst from the owners. But one of the things you understand when you represent both is that's not a valid assumption. Everybody has a valid reason to want to make sure that the contractor should be making money. Owner should be getting value. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. As long as the owner realizes, I mean, one of the benefits I had was like you, did spend a couple of decades litigating, and I've seen a lot of, estimates and how they actually make up their estimate and what they do in order to be able to make money. And so from that perspective, when I did the very first contract, there really was not a form. So I kind of just created it. And over the years, that has morphed into, really being specific about, it's a lot of lessons learned. It's really being specific about, we talked earlier about this validation period. Like, how do you get the parties on the same footing? That's the biggest risk, I think, in progressive design build, is that people go into it too quickly. And so it just was a lot of thinking. It was, in all honesty, Jeff and I have been talking for quite some time. We met each other in the mid 2000s. And so talking to other owners, what are you doing that's making sense? And just trying to incorporate all of that into a contractual model that actually can be repeated, so that when we go out to the industry, we, the contracts that I have put together and that, we've worked with DBIA really do. They're ones that the industry vets, that they can understand, that we've got a repeatable process here. I'm not trying to reinvent a wheel. I'm trying to make sure the wheel that we have works well for this particular process. And I think too many times lawyers come at it from, oh, we've got this whole new thing, we've got to completely redo it, which is not necessarily the case. There is a lot of stuff, there's a lot of stuff you need in a progressive design build contract that's not in any of the forms. But if you just think about it logically, and that was the approach that I've always taken, is that what is the logical way of going through this and actually working with the industry, from not just working with my client, but from a design builder's perspective, what makes sense to you, right? And so I think if you do that, you can come up with a contract that really works.
Well, and I think that's one of the issues that we've had in the IPD world, is a bunch of brainy people who were concerned about stuff sat down and said, well, here would be nirvana if we could get everybody to just play in the sandbox well together. Wouldn't that be great? And we didn't think enough about, well, how does the contractor make money out of this? And where do the trades come in? And what's their business proposition? And how do we get architects to actually talk about money and not think of it as a conversation that they need to have behind some closed door or in hushed voices, like, oh, we're artists, we don't talk about money, but you charge money. So, there are things that cost stuff. So this is great. So as Robynne was developing this contract, Jeff, you started to get into actually enabling it, looking at the kind of behaviors that you needed. I think you talked about, I know that you have talked about it in the past, trying to develop a team culture, on these projects so that people could actually buy into the work. I had Daniel Pink on the podcast, and I don't know if you know him, but he wrote
Oh
a
my
book
God,
called,
yes, that's
yeah,
awesome.
he's a great guy.
Absolutely.
And he talks about intrinsic incentive, and taking money off the table. And so the thing that I've always tried to do, in these IPD contracts that we've worked on, is get money off the table. Let's get it out there. Let's talk about it, and then get it off the table so people get excited about the project. So how did you take what the kind of work that Robynne's been doing and morph it into an actual delivery program for, $500 million program at an operating airport?
Multi-billion-dollar program.
Multi-billion dollar.
Almost $8 billion program.
Wow. That's like real money, even at I thought we were big at the California healthcare receivership, where we had $7 billion of stuff going on, but you trumped us. All right, I'm all in. I'm no longer in the World Poker Tournament.
That was Mike Meredith's project. I remember that project very well and visited Mike and got to know Mike during that
Yeah, and as we discussed, I talked to Robynne, I talked to Jeff earlier on, and I have a plaque on my wall where on that prison project we built healthcare inside of an existing prison in Stockton, an operating prison, and we did $60 million of construction in a single month, which is a ton of construction. And Mike was the guy that said, look, I love IPD, but we can't do this IPD because the California legislature doesn't know about it. So we have to sneak all these things in under design build, and he did it really well. So as you were working through that, how did you begin to morph into the project, and what was the culture you tried to create on the team?
So first, the culture wasn't just the team; it was an entire organization first.
Oh yeah, good point.
So we had to start with the organization first. But before we get to that, contracts are important. They are so important because they will establish the behavior you're going to get. They are. And when you if you issue a contract right off the bat to start a design and construction project with shifting all the risk away and transferring it all without ever having a conversation, bad stuff's going to happen. Because immediately everybody has got their hands tied. And so you can't have open discussions. The biggest thing there is the contracts are there to protect all the parties fairly. And I don't know all the legal terms, I'm not anything, but that's really what it is, to have a fair way of, when we get to the time, to not share, but transfer the risk, because owners will have to transfer the risk no matter what. We are not builders and we are not designers. We have to transfer that risk. I came to the conclusion that the one part I had control of within the project team are only three things. The risk that we have to work on, because we've got a good contract in place to take care of the things that have to do with insurance, processes and things of that nature that make sure we're compliant with all the laws. But we have absolute complete control over communication of what the vision is from an owner. We have complete control of the design within that project team, and we have complete control of the construction. And every party there is there to represent the risk they've got. And I believe the owner has the risk of communicating the vision. Designer has the responsibility to hear that vision clearly with the builder and design something within the approved budget. And then the builder has to execute a contract, final contract with the scope, cost, and schedule in it, according to what they participated in all the way along. So if those are the three things we have to focus and introduce Dan Pink and his book Drive. And what was interesting, and I knew about IPD. I had conversations with James Pease, which I'm sure you've talked to at length about back when he was with Sutter Health.
Yep.
And it always puzzled me about how much we pivoted around the money part of, this risk reward thing. And I go, God, I don't get that, because there's all these studies out there. And of course, you had Dan probably on board talk about it, that once people are paid fairly, more money doesn't help them. They don't get better. In fact, it's been shown when there's cognitive thought involved, they get worse at what they do.
Yeah.
Because the money becomes the objective. But what they are driven by is three things. They are driven by a common purpose, meaning when Barbara Jackson within an organization talks about the why, the purpose of why we're doing it.
Barbara Jackson of San Luis Obispo fame,
yes.
And the University of Denver. I taught a couple of
yeah.
courses for at DU. I'm sure she's one of all of our favorite people.
Yes, and I was introduced her a long time ago through my first boss, Nick Watry, way back in the whole. Anyways,
Awesome.
but if we have that common purpose, that part first, now in order to read that purpose, and it's co-created by the project team, right? Their aspirations. And Robynne and I talk a lot, even in our class, about you have certain things you have to contractually do, and then there's aspirations, right? And if we can create these two bars, anything that's above the contract towards aspiration, the project team owns. They own it, not all out here. And the theory is behind that is that if people can dream big, shoot for the sun, they might hit the moon, that type of thing. If you go big,
Right.
even if you make a headway up a little bit more, you're exceeding expectations because the contract is the low bar. And I remember our previous director used to say, yeah, I hire you to get our project done on time and on budget. Big deal. What about the outcome? Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that common purpose is the first thing. But the next thing is that we have to allow people autonomy, meaning they have to be able to be subject matter experts of what they do and free to think without group pressure all over them. They have to be given that trust, right? That idea that we trust people to do all these individual parts in a whole. So that requires not only two people to trust, but in team members to trust each other as different parts of that team. And so we have to build that culture built around all driving for that purpose so that we're all focused on it. We can have tough discussions about that. So that autonomy becomes the second part that's incredibly important. And the third part of that then was allowing people to master their skills, whatever they are. And that's a little bit more difficult sometimes in a project team setting. But what I think what Dan talks about in there is that we need to play games and have safe environments for people to be able to practice their skills of mastering something. If they want to do something greater, we need to give them a safe environment to do that. So for example, within a project setting in a validation phase where you are trying to develop a target cost, scope, and schedule, you're still developing it, but you can give some people freedom to go out and look at an alternative. And you know what? If it comes up good and it fits, everybody wins. But if it doesn't, so be it. You can still make the decision and nobody's hung up for it. So we create that environment where we allow builders, subcontractors to work freely outside and just be like they were like the lab in the classroom in college.
Yeah.
That's the whole idea, because architects, engineers do not work good when the pressure's on. I've been there. You don't, crisis is the worst possible thing you can have in design because your mind's not focused on it anymore. It's worried about getting into trouble. So that mastering and being able to do that, but that could also mean mastering music, art. It doesn't matter what you do, but that ability to do that you're given that freedom, that people feel comfortable to do that, to bring that even into our profession. So those three things. So then it drove into, okay, well, how do we create that environment? And that's where at the time we called it programming, internally, but now it's equivalent to the validation phase. For me, it was how do we move a time in our projects away from the commoditization of the process to a relationship? Just to talk. We're just going to talk. And how can we do that and develop our targets as we go through of how we're going to do this? What is the target scope, target budget, target cost, and have those discussions in a free environment? To me, if we can accomplish those things up front, now we can design to those things. We have targets now to shoot for, but we continue that conversation of that team because they develop that in the validation phase where they're safe. I forgot who I know I first read it in Steve Covey's book, but there's an idea that project teams have to form, but they got to storm.
Right.
They have to. Then after that, then they'll work through it and then they will perform. Storming and validation phase is how do you say, Robyn? It's like it's crazy time. It's not highly structured. It is a vetting of all these pieces, right? And you go through it. And as
a mix of
but as that team gels and goes through that hard time, they begin to trust each other. And now we got the added component of people being not afraid anymore and not playing the blame game, but driving towards that purpose that they all help create, that aspiration.
Right.
Then when we go through the design process now, it looks a lot like what we always used to do. We actually get a contract for design, not necessarily for the final cost of the construction yet, but because you have to. I mean, it is still a commodity that has to be transactioned for in a contract. Nobody's foolish enough to think we can still continue to do that. But we have a different agenda now where people have worked together to get to the targets, co-created them, made promises to each other. They're not going to be perfect, but they're a whole lot more reliable. And we work through that design process and we continue the culture through that design so that when we begin to, I call buy out the project, trades and the direct work, we continue that on into the construction phase because nothing's perfect along the way. We're just getting closer. We're getting closer. But the culture we've developed is one of trust, not one of it's your fault. But we're in this together, back to that purpose that we originally created. So the idea is how do we create that through the entire process? And part of that process is where the lean construction part, all of our, I call it last planner, we can talk more about that, but cost modeling, real-time information, revising the tools that we've got, not making sure everything has got to be a 20,000 critical path activity schedule coming out of the validation phase when you don't even know what the heck you're going to build yet. How do we stop this stuff? How do we just have a conversation and talk about this and set targets? We'll work towards those targets. When we're there, then we'll say, here's a modification or amendment to the contract to do as such.
There's a ton to unpack in everything that you've said there. And I'm sure Robynne has a ton of things to comment on it. But just in the storming period, for instance, I really do think that's the time when people are able to show their mastery and their autonomy, and you're figuring out who's going to be the leader here of this thing. And sometimes in the IPD world, in a big room, sometimes you get overwhelmed by collaboration, which doesn't drive you to project outcomes. And I think the thing that I share with the both of you is that I look at project outcomes first. I'm an outcome guy. I want to know where we're going. What's the target? What is it that we're trying to do? And what do we want that to be? So talked about it not being perfect, but getting to reliability. And I think that's what we need to get owners to understand. There is no such thing as cost certainty until you write the last check. There's no such thing until schedule certainty until you're walking in the building and hanging your coat on the rack that doesn't fall off the wall. So what you want is reliable. You want more reliable or less reliable.
Right.
Yep.
And yet we still put targets, we put financial targets and we put schedule targets in our contracts that are allegedly, as I like to say from my legal background, enforceable. So how do we deal with that conundrum? Because that I think is part of the problem, that you go along and you're very collaborative and cooperating. I mean, I think you have to use cooperation and collaboration different because they're two different kinds of things that happen. But you get there, and then at the end, somebody goes, I had to agree to $100 million. And if it's not $100 million, I'm done.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And Jeff, it's so funny because Jeff and I have been teaching the progressive design build class for DBIA for a long time. And he's all about, feelings and thoughts. And I'm all about efficiency and reliability. And how do we get to that point where we have a reliable cost, a reliable schedule? Because the reality is that owners only have so much money, and they usually have to get stuff done within a certain period of time, and they are struggling to try to figure out how do they get there. And usually the money is given to them by somebody else. Like a lot of my projects have legislative grants that they get it, they have to tell them how much they're going to spend, they get the money, it's usually a haircut that they have to take on the project, and then if they don't use it all, they got to give it back. So how do you deal with all of those realities? And what I try to do is, by creating those efficiencies, by creating those lines of communication that Jeff is talking about, and by getting as much information as early as possible in the project. And this is where that validation period comes in. And one of the reasons that Jeff and I have been really pushing for that as a best practice from DBIA's perspective. And that validation process basically says, look, we are earlier than any other delivery method going to be looking at what is the budget, what is a realistic initial scope, what is a realistic target. We're not talking about perfection, we're just talking about feasibility at this point, essentially. And then also, what are the big risks that we need to put into that realistic target and all of that stuff, so that when we come out of this validation period, we've got a clear understanding of given what we know on that day, is going to be a better understanding of what the project is. And as we go through with that clear understanding, that forms the basis of those lean techniques that I think are absolutely essential. The lean design and construction techniques. I am thankful every day for the Lean Construction Institute. That's not a paid plug, because you guys did the same thing. You thought about how can we be efficient? Well, how can we take all of these studies in getting things done well and implement them in the construction industry? And I think without those structured tools, people would be going at this just in many different ways. But if you utilize those structured tools, such as target value design, such as last planner, such as, all of those, I put requirements for lean design and construction techniques in my contracts, because I need people to have a structure. We can't just go into these projects without a structure. And so creating that reliability as early as possible, and then using that as our, North Star all throughout the project, I think is the way that we can create an industry where people do trust each other, because they aren't coming at it from, how can I make as much money on this project as possible? I mean, they could, I guess, but they won't get the next project if they do that.
Right. So what's interesting, I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff about what you said, but from my perspective, it focuses in on what I call the kind of the value definition at the beginning of the project. So what's the owner's value proposition? And it's both subjective and objective. There's an objective functional program, but then there's a subjective aspirations. We want an iconic building. We want this to be, excellence in design. There's things that are still a little bit fuzzy, but you want those two things. And then I take money and time out of the value proposition and put it into the constraint category.
Right.
Exactly.
Say, here's a constraint. We have to finish by this time, and this is the money we have. And those are and constraints are great because they're like targets, right? I mean, when we talk about target value design, we're talking about constraint design. We're designing to constraints.
For your swim lanes, what do you got to stay in?
And getting people to think about that. Now, when you bring people together in this, because I think we're all on the same page that, and Robynne, you even said this about estimates. All we can do in our world is predict. So, because we don't know, right? And we predict based on estimates, we predict based on schedules, we predict based on all kinds of stuff. And those estimates are full of assumptions. And if we can debunk the assumptions early on, that's part of that validation phase. Let me understand what you're carrying for labor on, how long it's going to take you to hang some ductwork. Let's understand that assumption so that we can see the buffer. Let's make the buffer transparent. So when I think about these things, I think about everything starts with transparency and openness. And the projects that you guys used to deliver, and Jeff, when you delivered those hard bid build contracts, they were always opaque. So when somebody had a problem, you couldn't really go to the books of the trade and go, oh, well, here's your problem. Let us help you solve this problem. All right. It was just, it's on you. And maybe bankruptcy is the only answer, right? So I start with this thing of transparency, and transparency allows you to collaborate, and then collaboration allows you to make commitments to each other that you can trust, that they're trustworthy commitments. And we think about projects as a network of commitments. So I think there's a lot that we share in common about how we try to address these issues. But it is interesting because we do, in the IPD world, we tend to say, well, let's share the risk and let's not sell it, because we've never found an efficient market for selling it. So Jeff, share with me a little bit about how you define what is the risk that you sell, or you reallocate, or you transfer, in order to make sure that the owner organization finds the delivery method palatable, because I'm assuming that that's the reason that you do it.
Correct. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain risks that owners just can't give away. For example, we can't give away what we really want. We have to communicate it.
Right.
And, there was a common thing they used to always ask, well, you should have known. What does that mean?
I had that conversation with my daughter the other day.
Should have known.
Happens all the time.
So that's a risk the owner can never give away. And there's other things that are just unforeseen that we can't, what's under the ground. You just can't shed that.
Right.
It's something you just have to acknowledge that you can't give that away. But the risk that we do want to give away is what we're not good at. That's why we're giving people profit. That's why
Yeah.
there wouldn't be a business model unless we could do that. One of them was we're not going to be able to generate the set of instructions to build with. We want to give that away. We want somebody to take that vision we communicate within the confines of separating what they can't determine. And I'll come back to that in a second in the design. But that's we want to give that away. We want to pay somebody to do that, to be fully responsible for it, meet the codes, do all. That's what we want. And the second big one is we're not builders. We don't coordinate trades. We don't coordinate work. We don't want to be responsible for the ultimate coordination of who comes and shows up at the site. None. And we don't want any part of it.
Right.
Because all we're going to do is mess it up. Because that's kind of what we've always done in design, bid, build.
Right.
Right. And so those are, to me, the big things that we want to do. And so going back to what we're trying to, this reliability thing, is if we work ourselves backwards from the end game, and absolutely, this is not, we do have budgets and we do have time constraints. There's no doubt about it. But if we start from the back and we come, the quickest way to build a project and the most economical way to do it is to have a great set of instructions to build from. That's well coordinated before you start building, that was priced right, and has minimal amounts of errors and omissions in them. Well, if that's true, then we're going to get the best price possible and the quickest way there. What's interesting is that last part is the most expensive part of the whole project.
Right.
So how do we get to that set of instructions? I really believe that set of instructions before you price something, let alone build it, is everything. If you make a mistake in that model or drawings, I'm more modernizing it, but in the model, here's what I do know, that if the model is, and I know we can't be perfect, is perfect, the build will go pretty smooth.
Right.
It will. But here's what happens when there's omissions that occur in that model. One of miscommunication by the owner of what they wanted, as well as mistakes that get made. When we go really fast through that part, mistakes get made. And those mistakes usually end up in construction. They always end up in construction getting solved, which is super expensive because you many times build it, tear it back out, and put it back in 3 times, 3 efforts
Right.
going into all that. And so I truly believe that is something we do. And I don't have enough time today, but I really think we don't value the design process enough, and we don't give it enough time. I truly believe that if we take longer in design and gave designers, architects, and engineers more time, we would actually be more efficient in construction. But then the last part of that is you still have to go through that design phase. And the reason why the targets, and back to the targets, as you mentioned, becomes so important is that, and one of the things that I've learned, and you mentioned, use the word buffer. You have to create buffer not only in schedules, but in cost estimating as well. And the reason we want to set those targets is because if you don't have targets, you don't know how you're doing. It doesn't mean you're going to hit every target granularly as you go along the way,
Right.
for an activity or a particular trade or a particular item, because it's impossible to get an estimate 100% right on quantities and everything. But statistically, you'll have winners and losers over the whole thing.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so you can reshift the target around both on schedule but creating that buffer to get to that right. What that does, and the reason why, for me, it's interesting is, Paulo really well too. He
Yeah.
talks a lot about the buffer. And what he taught me was, Jeff, we have a social engagement here going on. And what happens is that stuff's going to happen along the way as you go towards the targets because it's not perfect. And you're working towards the GMP and the final schedule, but the team needs a place to park things temporarily so that they can turn around and say, we're still good. We got plenty of buffer in here. And here's the interesting thing about buffers, both on the cost side and the schedule side, is if you let the team own those buffers 100% and executives stay out of it, who has the single biggest interest to put more time back in the buffer? The team does.
Right.
And the only way to put it in is to work together.
Yeah.
It's the only way to put more time back in. And so we're incentivizing people not monetarily, but we're using the risk of time and cost to actually give people a comfortable area that they can create bigger margins of buffers on.
Yeah.
What a huge motivation.
Yeah, it's almost like it's not an incentive, it's a challenge, right?
Yes.
Let's
yes.
throw the challenge out there and let's get genuinely curious and people excited about the challenge.
Yeah.
So in my practice, what I typically do on projects is I try to expose that buffer, and then I move it out of the schedule and I put it into the risk register, because I think of it as a risk, and you got to be able to see it to manage it. Right? If it's hidden, if a guy tells me it's 10 days, I'm going, come on, it can't. This contractor at Center Block told me one time it was 3 weeks to pour a 7,000 square foot slab. And I said, you could get trained monkeys in buckets to pour it in like 5 hours. What's wrong with you? And he said, oh, it must be something in the computer or something. I'm going, you got to own that, man. This is your schedule. So let's. This has been great so far, but I want to make sure that we get to kind of the model from your guys' perspective, both. So do you use both a progressive design to get to a fixed price and a progressive design to get to a GMP, where there's more, it seems to be more latitude?
Yeah. So I have clients who want to do both. And here is when I'm talking to them, I have a lot, I have a lot of very small clients, right? Small municipalities.
Right.
And as much as I love the GMP cost reimbursable model, it is difficult to administer. It's difficult to understand when you get those big pay applications with all of that stuff in there. And so one of the things that I try to encourage is, if there is a cost that you're totally good with, and there's not a lot of contingency in that cost that you might want to use for something else, or you just think, if you were to get a low bid for this, is that something you'd be okay with? I'm fine with them turning it into a lump sum, because then they know how to manage that. That is something that is within their wheelhouse. They aren't, utilizing that administrative time to be able to do it. It's easier to audit from that perspective if they've got auditors who are very picky about that. And even if we don't lump sum the entire thing, I will often say, hey, what about the general conditions cost? Those are the same every month. You're going to get the same thing every month. Let's put that in there. Let's put some overhead and profit. It'll get a lump sum for that. And then if the design builder can do better, great. But that's something that we can that's not a cost we're going to be examining. One of the other things is that, not for nothing, but small owners, they tend to think of that the money under the GMP as their money. It's not their money. It's the design builder's money. And they'll be like, why are you spending this on, this kind of paper? I want to get that out of the conversation. So if, to the extent that I can do that, but then, however, in those situations where the parties have agreed to put a contingency in, or an allowance, one of the two, in underneath that GMP, and it's one that is intended to capture a risk that is really unknown and that could be significant, it actually benefits the parties to keep that transparent. One, it builds trust. Two, if for some reason, if you get to the point where that contingency gets retired, the owner will often have the ability to maybe put in additional scope if they've already agreed to that, but it also, by allowing for that contingency in underneath the GMP, you've basically told the design builder, we're going to let you make a profit on this. We're not going to have you shorten up your contingencies or take a big risk. We're putting that risk in the GMP. We're making it known. We're going to allow you to have a profit. But you know what? If it doesn't come to pass, we're going to figure out how to utilize that money underneath the GMP, or to do something else with it. I find that it keeps the trust going, and it doesn't, there's a perverse incentive sometimes with these GMP contracts for the design builder to, utilize the whole thing. So I think it helps under those circumstances to keep that transparent. But it's a question. If there's, if they're like, yeah, we're good with the number, we think we're going to come up right up against it, just lump sum it.
Yeah, I think so. When I think about those things, I think that lump sum is basically contract management. So if you can do contract management in real time, rather than 30 days later or 45 days later or whatever, and you can do it, then that's a skill set that doesn't require new knowledge, and it usually doesn't
Right.
require added on resources.
Right.
But GMP, where you're doing time and materials,
A
that's
lot.
significant. But the
Yeah.
other thing is the thing I tell owners, especially larger owners, and Jeff, I'd like your comment on this. If you do transparency through the time and materials, and all the way down to the trades, to the major trades, I mean, you're going to lump some trades anyway in our
Most
Yeah.
of it is lump sum.
The trades end up being lump
so
sum.
It is lump sum.
okay, so in our world, we actually have probably 60 or 70% of the trades that are transparent time and materials, so we can see it. And the reason for that is not only the fairness to the team, because we've waived liability between each other and everybody needs to be able to look at everybody else, but it's also to allow the Jeffs of the world to build a real-time benchmarking system where the actual costs of your project, and it at the trade level, so that your benchmark now is better than going to Altus or Smith Johnson or some big benchmarking firm and saying, well, it ought to cost about this. Now you have real-time data that you can start to manage in your benchmarking process. But it doesn't sound like you guys do much of that.
I have a provision in my contracts that basically says that you're not going to lump sum unless we agree that you can.
Okay.
And so the default in my contracts is that it will be transparent, but the reality is that there are a lot of subcontractors who do not have the capacity to be able to do a cost reimbursable contract, particularly when you're talking about if you're aiming for small, diverse contractors, they usually don't have that capacity. So you need to be flexible in that. But if it is a major contractor where we really want to see what those costs are, the default is transparency, but the reality is most of the time it's not.
And it gets tricky because they have proprietary stuff, and they think that they think that they've solved a problem that nobody else in the world has solved. And I've looked at everybody's system; it's almost 97% exactly the same.
Exactly.
Nobody has this secret sauce for this stuff. It's just it's an amazing hubris. Like, oh yeah, we're successful because we know this. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to point. I think there's a misconception that the GMP is a T&M. It's not a time and materials. It is a fixed cost with a contingency at the end of it. And I think what Robynne talked very well about it, though. But even with that contingency, think of it. The owners need to think of it like a lump sum. Don't look at the allowances and the contingency as a place to start saving money. It's a lump sum. And so, if you talk to both of us, we see the GMP once you get there. It's a lump sum. It is not T&M. And the reason I don't believe you should, as an owner, I'd be scared to death to go take on a $1 billion terminal building on T&M. I don't ever want to be caught in a point where we agreed to something where the design was not even started to a price and find out halfway through it that you're 20% over budget. Of nobody's fault. It just was. And that's crazy talk to me. And that's what I love about Progressive Design Build is that the closest we can get to where it's fair to commoditize the trade work is finish the design, finish it, and then get a price. That's what that's the risk we're trying to transfer away.
So one of the benefits of collaborative design, especially with big trades, is that if you get the trades in that validation phase, and you're paying them time and materials, they can design the way that they're going to install the work that's going to be done. And they can actually use the model effectively to say, that doesn't make sense from our perspective. Why don't we do this? And you can actually, I've done this before. We walk crews through the model.
Exactly.
So we're on this floor, and how long is it going to take you to do that? And we talk about these things, and that is the base assumption for what the labor is. And then in our world, we go back and they charge us time and materials based on that. But I can see that you could quantify that, and you could then do a risk priced contingency.
That's correct.
Where you say these are all the risks and this is the likelihood that they're going to happen. And then that contingency, to the extent that they manage the entire contingency, that doubles their profit or whatever.
Exactly. So, and one of the things I think that there's a misconception is that Progressive Design Build does. The best practice is to get as many of the trades up on board immediately after award, but before the completion of validation, to make sure that certain target for that particular trade is resolved through the person who's actually going to do the work. These reliable promises, right? What's interesting about that is that it does require you to start with them and negotiate a GMP, if you will, at that trade level with them after the design is completed. But I believe that to be a great thing, because they set their targets during validation that we agree to, and they are working towards their own targets. And is it guaranteed? No, but I bet you it's got a whole lot better chance of being successful.
Have you ever done a lump sum design assist contract basically for those trades? And then it's theirs to win. I mean, if they perform well, by the time you get to the end of validation, you go, okay, we're gonna award you the contract. If they suck at it, you can pivot and
Yeah,
move
I've seen design builders do that. They use them as a design assist. And people have different, because there's always the issue of, if when you bid it out later, that one firm, they're going to be cheaper because they've been on the project and they know it better. And it's difficult to get those bids in later. You really want to make sure that if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that the entity that you're working with is probably the entity that's going to do the work. And
right.
because there are issues on the other side of that.
I completely agree too, is that pure design assist where you have somebody assist and then everybody's going to turn in a price, that's a train wreck to me.
Yeah.
I've done that long ago, and I can tell you just like how crazy that can get, because design assist means you're ultimately not going to have any skin in the game. You're like free.
Yeah.
You're out of it. And skin in the game is okay. A little bit of conflict is good. I always use the analogy that, it's funny how a running back being chased down by a 250-pound linebacker picks up the speed.
Right.
But they're okay with that because there's an end zone at the end of that run, right? So there's a game, there's
a goal line.
There's a goal, and it's positive, right? Because there's a adrenaline flow, right? God, we can, right? You need a little bit of that push. But I'm a big fan of, getting that designer on board. And I want to just going to break this down a little bit too, is when people get, what's nice about if you bring on mechanical, electrical, plumbing, for example, and curtain wall and fire protection, the typical design build large pieces, you're talking about 60 to 70% of the project cost.
Yeah, for sure.
That only leaves you 30% in that GMP that you're not going to have a pretty good price on at the validation phase. Talk about reliability of your cost model. When 70% of it, you've already talked to the people that are actually going to do the work and met with the stakeholders and heard it and balanced it and all worked together with all the other trades. Dick, that's as good as reliability is ever going to get on the forecast.
That's kind of how I think of it. I think bring the major systems on, so you're convinced that you'll be warm and you'll be watertight.
And you're selecting the right
things are going to work, right?
Yeah. So there's another aspect to this, which is, what we're talking about is just this contract, right? We're only talking about this project, but the reality is, and as a lawyer, and Dick, I'm sure you experience this too. We can say, oh, we want collaboration, cooperation, but you can't legislate that in a contract. You can't legislate behaviors.
Yeah.
But there are significant motivators that exist in this delivery method that do not exist in other places, which is, if you don't do a good job on this contract, you're not going to get the next contract, not just with this owner, but with all the other owners, because especially with progressive design build, we encourage people to talk and to look at people's past performance on projects and see how they did on that. And if they were not collaborative, not cooperative, if they screwed their subcontractors, if they couldn't get a reliable price or couldn't get something done on time, they are literally not going to do the next project. Because I remember really distinctly, I was representing contractors, and when we started to do qualifications and focused procurement in Washington, instead of saying, sure, fine, we'll sue them. It's no, just file the claim. It doesn't matter. We'll be low next time. And, there was no other, restriction on getting that project. And now, once we changed, I remember people going, no, don't file a lawsuit. Let's try to negotiate this. Let's try to, we want to get that. We want to get those big projects that are going design build. We want those. And there were contractors that completely changed their model for the sole reason that they understood they weren't going to get the next project unless they performed well on these. And that is a powerful, powerful motivator for folks.
Yeah.
And it also feels better It just does. Let's
Well, I mean,
let's
having
do the best thing we can for this project. It feels better.
who said that we shouldn't have fun on these projects?
Oh
We
my,
shouldn't be we
Exactly.
shouldn't
oh
be
my
proud of
God.
these projects, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It shouldn't be that we've got to stop this idea that it has to be a miserable process
Yeah.
and giving their weekends back and all this thinking about this stuff. People are there at their best when they're having, particularly architects and engineers, being one. Oh my God, when you in an iterative process of design, when people are putting pressure on you, you just take shortcuts, man, to get out. You be ultra conservative. And
Right.
here's what happens: the price goes up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny when I was running the LCI, one of the things I would say is that lean design and construction tools are the full employment act for soccer coaches because you can get your weekend back. You don't have to be stuck in a trailer someplace
Yeah.
noodling through all of this paperwork that you have to fill out, because it's not adding value and you're losing, you're losing a quality of life.
Do you know how much time? I would imagine that there's 30%, and I look at those labor production curves that have been done by SciFi program at Stanford,
Yeah.
and Chicago. There's proof out there that we are probably use 30% of the cost resources on our projects just to fix the mistakes we made along the way.
Right. Exactly.
And all those lead to is opportunities to point the finger at each other and break down that trust. But if we can stop this vicious cycle of not focusing on reliability of every decision we make, instead of trying to meet a clock all the time, we'll still end up faster. And that's counterintuitive.
Right.
Back to my point too is, hey, I believe that if we spend more time on design, we can actually go faster during construction. I really
Well, there's research that shows for every hour that you plan, you save 4 hours in the field. So it's your gut instinct is absolutely right. And the other thing I think is that when we're trying to empower people to their mastery and their autonomy. I mean, I agree with you that Dan Pink's, the twin things there. You really have to walk the walk, right? You have to be able to do that. So that leads me to the question of one of the things that you had said, Jeff, is that you control construction as the owner. You can actually control that. And you said you can control the design, you can control the common purpose, and you can control the construction. So how do you transition once you say, okay, design build team, you're here, here's your GMP, here's your contingency, let's go. How do you then participate in construction in a more meaningful way than just going to AOC meetings and looking at a CPM schedule that's 24/7 and 15 months behind?
That's really simple. It's really, if we have set up everything when we hit construction and we have our reliability, our role as an owner now is, if we're giving that risk away, is to ask one simple question: how can we help you be successful? Not be checking you all the time. It doesn't, you got to trust but verify. I'm not saying you're an idiot to all this, but your major focus is on, hey, how quick, be out in front of it. Hey, it looks like you're a little tight on that review. I know we're supposed to wait 10 days, but you know what? I'm going to get it back to you in 2 days. That's your attitude now. I call it servant leadership.
Yeah.
The idea that you become part of the problem, not the problem. You have certain tools at your disposal and you share those tools with people and you work those things through. Instead of trying to protect yourself, you're protecting the project. You become an advocate for that project, no matter what. And as I always reminded people, I used to hear that, oh my God, well, they're doing better because they got a better design build team. And I go, God, I wish I had that one, but I got to get everybody across the line. Well, here's what I know. We are all successful on our projects if the design builder gets it, is successful. That's the only thing I know. And if they're not successful, we're all failures.
Right.
Where do you think I worry the most about? It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's just we got to get them across that line.
Right.
And
Put
that
the project first.
yeah, and that doesn't mean you're not going to have problems. They're going to come up, but you got to deal with them and tackle them and get them resolved. And you got to serve away in whatever your power you can to try to do that. Hey, stuff can go bad. Hopefully, you've got a great contract in place that lets everybody know the way things are going to go down. If stuff happens, it does happen. What we're trying to do is make it so it happens a lot less, so it becomes manageable. One of the things I like to think about lean construction and why I love it is we're not playing the end game. We're tinkering as we go. And the reason why we tinker is because it's easy to fix something that's 1% off than it's 30% off.
Yeah, for sure.
1% doesn't scare us. It's like, oh, status normal, right? versus 30%, the whole world knows it and they start frowning on you, looking down on you like, what happened here? And quite frankly, they're right. It's not like that train wreck, like in a second. It happened over months of people not tinkering and solving it. And so, this idea during construction is tinker, use last planner accordingly, plan out a good 6 weeks ahead. Don't plan out 2 years in advance, set targets out there and work your way through. Combining that with targets and that you can actually create a last planner system that actually can forecast where you are in construction. Paul has taught us a really great way, taught me great ways of doing that, and how you combine the buffer, contingency, milestone constraints as well into that. We can actually do all those things like we used to do with critical path scheduling, because critical path scheduling for planning is a nightmare.
Right.
Oh my God. I could have a whole conversation about, did you know where critical path scheduling came from? It came from assembly line construction.
Yeah. And making a submarine back in the day and making computers, it really is crazy. I mean, what's funny is you don't have to be in construction very long to know that the structure is the longest pole in the tent, right, during the early days of construction. But it doesn't matter once you get past the fourth floor. What matters is jamming people into the first floor to start the rough-in work and get them going. Yeah. And that's not, quote, on the critical path. Are you kidding me? Well, that is the critical work that needs to be done.
So I just, both Robynne and you as attorneys, I think hopefully, and I don't have any proof of this, but I love it how the contract says only 20%, old design bid builds, only 20% of the activities could be on the critical path. The other 80%, you have to get 80% that are off of it, which means we make them up to create the other 80%, make them up, right? Legally, make them up. And have you ever noticed that the critical path schedule that you start with is never the one you end up with? It always comes out of that 80% that you weren't calling critical, where in last planner, we see everything as opportunity to go faster.
Right.
We're not creating float, we're using drift. We're coming forward, we're moving forward. We don't have things to worry about like early start to early finish to late. We don't have all those confines. We're like,
exactly.
I commit you down to the hour of what I'm going to do. And all I know is we will go faster. Even if you use last planner and you go through a project that has a contractual milestone and let's just say everything goes perfect and the project goes longer, you probably had a flaw in your schedule from the get-go. Because one thing I know, no project delivery system can fix a bad budget and a bad schedule.
Right. Well, so normally what happens, I think when you have those, because I've tried critical path cases before. I had a critical path jury trial. We had 7 consultants and the jury came up with their own critical path. It was like, this is crazy. But one of the things for sure, that if projects are late, it's typically because the work that was necessary to be done wasn't ready to be done when it was called for. Yeah. So you didn't have a logistics plan that got you the stuff that you needed when you needed it. You didn't have people understanding that they weren't making commitments. They were just kind of looking at, and you look at one of those P6 schedules and you start on page 27 and then you go to page 38 and then you go to page 42 and you go back to page 31 and you go, I have no idea what I'm doing here.
Well, what's so funny about it, if you take people and say, okay, the average person that looks at a critical path schedule, do you know what a forward pass is? And they'll go, I have no idea what you're talking about, let alone what a backward pass is.
Football.
Yeah, I'm like, no. And they go, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And then you start actually, I used to have a diagram of just 5 activities on it that did it in critical versus last planner.
Right.
And I would say, here's the map. Here's the computer algorithm that gives you the critical path. You go forward, you come backwards to get the flow. It's purely based off of that duration, successor, predecessor. It's a fixed thing, but it works under the assumption that every duration and every relationship is perfect. The second there's one flaw in those 2 relationships,
right,
it doesn't work. That's what it works on assembly line or submarines where you're going to build a lot of something because you can test the accuracy of each activity, how long it's going to take.
Oh yeah.
And Henry Ford knew this, right?
And that's really tact time, right? I mean, that's when you're on an assembly line, you're really doing tact time. You're really not doing this other stuff. I mean, I think of last planner scheduling both as a conversation and as a start, stagger. And you never have to worry about finish because people just don't leave their work in the middle of a project, right? Everybody finishes what they're doing. Yeah. And finishing work hardly releases anything. Except in some crucial things like sandy, mudding and sanding drywall, something like that. Wow. Okay. So I have taken a lot of your time, but I do want to get your input on how do you contrast progressive design build
Oh,
as you
sure.
guys deliver it with IPD and alliancing?
Yeah. So the behaviors, I would say, are very, very similar. We are trying to drive the same efficiencies, the same behaviors, the same relationships as IPD and alliancing. The biggest difference I see is since, when you look at the contractual risks in IPD and alliancing, it's the owner that is driving those risks because the owner, we also traded, we work on consensus, we work on all of that kind of stuff. But what we look at is at the end of the day, when you're making a decision, where are we in that process? And once you've set the GMP, then we allow the design builder to determine how to make sure that they are going to make uh, achieve those performance requirements that we've set out in the project, right? And when we shift that risk to the design builder, we say, look, you're going to determine how to do this, and we're going to pay you to take care of that. That then the owner is saying, look, if that performance requirement doesn't work, it will. You're responsible for figuring out how it works. In IPD, if the project doesn't perform as anticipated, it doesn't perform as set forth in the contract, the owner is really taking that risk. They are managing that risk all along the way. But there's a no sue clause. There is the liability on the designer and the constructor are very different. It's intended to drive different behaviors. But if you've set up the project so that everybody is aiming towards the same thing, hopefully you'll be able to have similar behaviors. But at least legally, that's the biggest difference that I see. The reality is, once we set up a project where people are actually thinking about the project first, where they're making decisions in the best interest of the project, and everybody is driving towards a good result at the end of the day, the behaviors are really they're the same with IPD and alliancing, and you would hardly know the difference in those projects. So that's how I contrast them.
So Jeff, as an owner, practically, what's your take on that?
IPD, my education of IPDs is very little. I obviously I live in the Bay Area, kind of the heartbeat of it with the healthcare all around. So lots of discussions, even at our owners forums. To me, I think Robynne pretty much covered it. I think the other thing too is an IPD fundamentally always talks about shared risk to reward. Progressive design build doesn't emphasize that. It emphasizes an aspiration part of, and I'm not talking contracts or, forget about the contract, but forget about
Right.
the culture that it wants to create. It's driven by a purpose, not by fear of losing profit.
Right.
And that's just a fundamental difference. And I think that, Dan, that's why I read, got this inspiration from Drive. It tells you the money part of it isn't the problem in my mind.
Right.
It's the people that don't have a purpose. I also still believe that one way or the other, it's still ultimately this gets to a transaction, just like a design bid build job. We've got to get there. It's too much money. And from a public perspective, there's no way I want to take the risk on $1 billion project that if the profit gets all used up on a T&M basis and I have to cover that, I'm not going back to my commission to say that. No way in God's green earth am I going to do that.
Right.
But I am on the hook contractually now for that. Why would I take that risk when so much of it was out of my control?
So
the biggest risk construction, I had no control over that.
exactly. Okay. So that makes some sense to me. Obviously, have you guys ever flirted with shared savings if the design builder comes in under the GMP? Have you ever
Yeah, I've flirted with it. The problem is for my clients, most of them, if they don't use the money, they have to give it back.
Right.
So a lot of times what I'll look at, and I have to give credit to the University of Washington for doing a very good job of pioneering this. They actually have a set of deferred work, like established, and Jeff has talked about this a lot as well, which is we have work that is deferred, that we are developing, that we understand the cost of, that we'll have a schedule that says, look, as of this date, this contingency is retired. We're going to put back in this deferred work. And UW has basically said, and we'll incentivize you to do that. So what they're trying to do is provide an incentive, not for shared savings, because they have to give all their money back too. They're trying to incentivize putting in that work that we think may be able to get in there, but we can't put it in the baseline GMP because there's a contingency in the way,
Right.
So I've done more of that lately. That's kind of been the way that I've seen that. The shared savings to my clients, it doesn't do them any good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to follow, back to that idea of deferred. I think having that contingency and you got to let the design builder use it. And let's start with the premise that, who's the biggest protector of that contingency is actually the design builder, because if it goes over, they're on the hook for it. So they're going to be very protective of it. So I don't have any problems with them managing it because they're going to be way better at it. And so the potential for savings actually just lies with letting them control it, actually. Second part of that is that just to kind of go back to what UW does and also at SF. It's funny, both places, institutions came to it the same exact way. We define in the base GMP, as we're going through targets, what's called deferrable scope.
Right.
And decisions that it's a certain percentage, maybe 10%, but it goes down. We used to call it below the line. Now we've kind of concluded and just call it deferred. It's now taken out of the base work and it's carried along. What's nice about that is if you have deferrable work, it's a certain percentage, and deferred work, when you actually buy the job out or go to trade, you can say, hey, price this thing as a deduct or price this thing as an add. That gives tools later on down the road in case stuff happens to work it out. And
you
so
can skinny it or you can expand it.
Yeah. And
so that sounds a bit like the owner's wish list that we would have.
Exactly.
The added value incentive items.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It's still there.
Similar.
And as Robynne alluded to, most of our projects use the whole entire GMP, but that's because there's a discussion about how to use the remaining contingency. Because one of the things is that if you can get to that contingency work, you can get closer to your aspiration, which remember, that's still the driver. Oh, and by the way, you get additional profit margin on top of that as well. Right. So there's a benefit to get more work in there as well. But you can't get there unless you save it, but it's being driven by an aspiration. So it seems to complete that circle. It's not perfect. It's not.
I get it. Is there some special treatment of profit in PDB, or is it just basically it's guaranteed profit because you've come up with a guaranteed price, and if you go over it and you dig into your own pocket, of course you lose profit. But is there like, we're going to pay you profit in advance to really take money off the table?
I have, mainly with federal funding, I have taken profit out and created a lump sum just so that they're not worried about, and I do it on the entire cost of the work, so that they're not worried about not making their entire profit. So even if you have a contingency in there in a contract that for phase 2, for the second phase, because we don't know where this is in the first phase. Right. But in that second phase, I will basically pay for overhead and profit on the entire work. So they're guaranteed their overhead and profit for the whole cost of the work. They're not trying to increase the cost of the work in order to maximize their overhead and profit. Treating that as a lump sum is compliant with federal cost allocation principles. So that's another reason to do it. But I also find that it just takes whatever perverse incentive there is to maximize the cost of the work to meet so that they maximize their profit. I'm like, look, if you've managed that whole thing, you're entitled to the whole profit from my perspective.
Yeah. And
so that's typically how I will do that.
And I know some got this perception that it's a guaranteed profit, but Dick, the way you just said it to start the discussion, exactly what happens. We address it upfront during the procurement process of what overhead and profit fee do you want as a percentage of the direct cost. Yep. It's done and over with. That part is done and over with. It is, I guess you could say, guaranteed. We never call it that's not guaranteed. We just say that's what it is. But that does not guarantee on the direct cost of construction. If that's what you're doing and you lose money in that and it eats into your profit, Yes, that's fine, but we're not into that. That's done deal. So from our perspective, we've given you the profit, we've agreed to it. You establish it during the procurement process in a fair way, told us what it was,
Right.
but you still got to do your job.
Right.
Because part of the reason why we're giving you that profit is you do your job. And that is being fair, by the way. It's a two-way street. That's why I say, if you lose money because we failed to communicate, that's a different story. But if you fail because you miscoordinated the work, that's not an owner's problem. That's why we're giving you the profit.
Right.
And I think we have to remember that this is still a business. I mean, it's still a huge, gigantic transaction. There's good money to be made, but there's a lot of risk in it, and not everybody can just cover that risk. We've got to assign it to the party that can manage it the best and say, you own that bucket over here.
Yeah.
What we can control is that alignment of it before we price it out. That's what we have control of.
I used to think of hard bid build as there's kind of an owner's hubris about we could get something for less than it actually costs.
Yeah.
You know what? That never happens.
It's not an outlet mall, right?
That is like Santa Claus can actually get down the chimney. That's just not going to happen.
Well,
yeah.
So let me ask you one quick question about change orders. Do you have as a matter of data, is there a percentage of project costs that you see in progressive design build that come in as change orders, or are change orders basically a lost art? You don't see much of that.
Well, one of the things is that when you have built in a lot of the risks all the way through validation, and when by the time you get to that GMP, you have looked at a lot of the major risks, statistically, you do have fewer change orders, but it's not that they don't happen. I don't have a percentage. Jeff, do you have?
No.
Yeah.
It's
very project specific.
I can make a general, if it's one relative to errors of omission, it's 0. But we do have, if unforeseen conditions occur, there's still change orders. But I would say the most guilty party of change orders on a progressive design build comes from the owner for scope changes.
Owners changing scope.
That decisions that didn't get made way back in the validation. Yeah. And
stakeholders couldn't make up their mind.
Yeah. And Robynne and I will talk a lot about that decision making at the right time. You have to make that in progressive design build, because so many you've made reliable promises, and what people cannot do is progressive design build is not an open book to continue design into design. You can't continue your program into design. You can, and it's easy to do. You're going to pay dearly for it now. I get it that there are better. Progressive design build is not a silver bullet. If you can't make up your mind in the validation phase and have most of the decisions made, and you start doing those during design, let alone during construction, there are probably better ways to deliver a project.
So that's the fourth thing that owners totally control, is their ability to make timely decisions.
Absolutely, because
they have to be disciplined.
It has such huge expenses we talked about earlier. Every time you make a change in design or construction, it's 3 times the work.
All right. Well, this has been terrific. Time has flown by. I can't believe how much time we've actually spent here. I really appreciate both of you, and I applaud your great work out there. And I want you to continue it. So thanks for joining us today.
Oh my gosh, Dick, thank you for asking. This is great. I'm glad we could get this together.
And Dick, it's good to see you. It's been about a year since I saw you. I think it was last October in Detroit.
Yeah. Well, and this has spurred so many questions in my mind that hopefully we might be able to do this again in a little while down the road, and maybe explode a project and say, here's how we start that stuff. So.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lean Construction Blogs podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help us spread the word by sharing, subscribing, or leaving a review on your preferred podcast listening platform. Remember to join us next time as we continue to lower the barriers to applying lean construction and help take your lean journey to the next level. And don't forget to visit the Lean Construction blog to stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, weekly blog posts, monthly webinars, and upcoming conferences. We hope to see you on the next episode.